The trauma board flickered again. 3 incoming ambulances rerouted within 6 minutes. That did not happen unless something upstream was broken. The charge nurse blamed a software delay. Someone else blamed city traffic. The new nurse said nothing. She stood at the edge of the station, pen still in her hand, eyes fixed on the timestamps rather than the noise around her. Patterns were rarely loud. They were quiet. They showed themselves in small irregularities that others stepped over. She wrote the ambulance numbers down on the back of her folded report sheet. Not because anyone asked her to, because something felt measured, not random. A paramedic wheeled in the first patient. Mid-30s male, blunt trauma, severe lacerations along the forearms. The story was construction debris collapse. The injuries were too clean for debris, too directional. She cleaned the wounds without comment, noting powder residue embedded in fabric fibers. She did not react. Reaction spreads faster than facts. A senior nurse snapped at her to move faster. She nodded once and continued at the same pace. Calm hands do not slow a trauma room. They steady it. The second ambulance arrived within 4 minutes. Another construction accident. Another patient with similar injuries. Shrapnel patterning along the lateral thigh, not scattered, grouped. She adjusted the IV line, secured the airway tape, and looked briefly toward the ambulance bay doors. The radio chatter from city dispatch was thinner than usual. Short responses, no background crosstalk. Dispatch channels rarely went quiet during multi-unit responses. Quiet meant control or failure. She logged the arrival times again, 21:17, 21:23, 21:27, intervals narrowing. Someone laughed near the medication cart, joking about city contractors cutting corners. She did not correct them. Correction without proof becomes argument. Instead, she walked to the supply room and checked the secondary oxygen tank levels. Full. She counted portable monitors, 4 operational. She repositioned one closer to Trauma Bay 3 without announcing why. Preparation is quiet when done properly. The third patient arrived with burns inconsistent with falling steel, flash burns, brief exposure, contained blast radius. She recognized the pattern but did not allow the recognition to change her expression. Her pulse remained steady. She flushed the IV line and asked the paramedic one question in a tone so even it did not interrupt the room. Was there a secondary collapse? The paramedic hesitated half a second too long. We were told it was contained. Told by who, she wondered. Not asked aloud. Told. She marked that word internally. Across the hall, a junior resident complained about supply shortages. The charge nurse barked orders. The hospital moved as it always did. Loud, reactive, layered in authority that depended on hierarchy more than clarity. She adjusted the triage tag slightly, shifting one patient from delayed to immediate. Based on respiratory decline, no one else had noticed yet. She did not announce the change. She simply handed the updated chart to the attending physician and pointed to the oxygen saturation trend. He frowned, then nodded. No acknowledgement beyond that. She did not need it. At 21:31, the dispatch monitor froze for 3 seconds, long enough for her to see the active incident log disappear and reload with a simplified header. Industrial accident. No unit identifiers listed. That was not standard formatting. She stepped closer as if checking lab results. The system refreshed again. Clean. Too clean. Someone had compressed the report. She felt the early tightening in her chest that always preceded confirmation of risk. Not fear, calculation. If this was coordinated, more would arrive. If more arrived, triage flow would collapse unless lanes were pre-assigned. She quietly moved 2 empty gurneys from the hallway into a diagonal position near the ambulance entrance, creating a controlled funnel. A technician asked why she was rearranging traffic. She replied softly, "It will reduce cross-movement." He shrugged and walked away. She returned to the trauma bay and replaced a half-empty crash cart drawer before anyone noticed it was low. Restraint is not passive. It is disciplined timing. The fourth ambulance siren approached faster than the others. Not staggered. Direct. She looked at the wall clock. 21:36. The intervals were no longer narrowing. They were accelerating. Around her, the hospital still believed in coincidence. She believed in sequence, and sequences meant intent. She secured her gloves tighter at the wrist and prepared for what had not yet been announced. The fourth ambulance did not stop at the usual bay marker. It braked hard and angled toward the entrance as if the driver wanted the doors aligned with the hallway rather than the triage line. That small deviation forced the orderly to reposition the ramp and delayed the intake by seconds that felt longer than they were. The patient inside was conscious but disoriented, clothing intact except for concentrated tearing along the torso seams. Not impact tearing. Pressure tearing. She guided the gurney through the funnel she had created earlier, and for the first time the flow did not collide with waiting patients. No one noticed why. They only noticed it worked. The paramedic began the handoff using the same construction site narrative. She listened only to the physiological details: tachycardia without proportional blood loss, pupils reactive but slow. She cut away the shirt and found a shallow puncture channel along the rib margin, clean entry, no exit, edges darkened by heat. Contained blast fragment, low mass, high velocity. She placed a sterile dressing and spoke quietly to the resident. Scan chest before sedation. He frowned at the order coming from a new nurse, but followed it when he saw the patient's breathing change half a beat later. The portable monitor she had moved earlier powered on without needing a search for batteries. The hallway filled faster now, voices overlapping, stretchers lining walls that had been clear 10 minutes ago. A security guard tried to direct families away from the ambulance doors but kept stepping into the path of incoming staff. She asked him once, calmly, to stand 2 feet left of the frame so the corridor stayed open. He did, not realizing she had just established a lane that would hold for the next 20 minutes. Overhead, paging requested additional surgical teams, though no surgeon had yet declared a mass casualty event. The charge nurse argued into a phone about bed availability while another ambulance siren approached before the previous one had cleared. She watched the dispatch screen again. The incident header remained simplified, but the incoming unit numbers flickered briefly before vanishing. That meant manual filtering. Someone upstream was controlling information flow. A fifth patient arrived carried rather than rolled, paramedics abandoning the stretcher to move faster. This one had superficial injuries, but kept repeating that there had been 2 sounds, not 1. The staff dismissed it as shock confusion. She did not contradict them. She marked the words internally and adjusted triage placement to observation instead of discharge, quietly instructing a technician to keep the patient within sight lines of the nurse's station. The medication cabinet locked for 3 seconds and reset. The pharmacy system lagged behind the patient count. She opened the manual override key box, not to trigger alarms, but to confirm accessibility, then closed it again without comment. Preparation without declaration prevented panic. A physician demanded to know why patients were stacking near the entrance instead of dispersing down the corridor. She answered simply, "Ambulance cycle time is decreasing. Moving them deeper will slow intake." He hesitated, checked the doorway as another siren cut short, and allowed it. Outside communication thinned further. Radios produced clipped acknowledgments rather than conversation. The usual chatter of multiple agencies was absent, replaced by isolated confirmations as if each unit were operating inside separate information bubbles. The 6th arrival brought a paramedic with blood on his sleeve that was not his patient's. He said another team had redirected after losing contact with site command. No one followed the implication except her. Loss of on-scene command meant either evacuation or containment failure. She secured an airway on a semi-conscious patient while tracking the clock. intervals now under 3 minutes. The hospital leadership debated whether to activate disaster protocol, worried about overreaction. She did not argue policy. She walked to the whiteboard and, without drawing attention, separated trauma bays into 2 columns, writing small numbers at the top edges that looked like routine bed tracking. In practice, it created primary and secondary assessment zones. Staff naturally followed the nearest open space, and the flow divided without instruction. A lab technician nearly collided with a gurney, but corrected course through the gap she had left earlier. The corridor held. A maintenance worker reported that one exterior camera feed had frozen at the ambulance entrance. Security assumed network congestion. She noted the exact camera angle that would now be blind and adjusted the waiting family chairs 2 feet inward, keeping civilians away from the unseen area without raising concern. Another patient arrived with hearing damage but minimal external injury, classic overpressure exposure. The pattern was no longer arguable. Coordinated detonations with controlled yield. She rinsed debris from the patient's ear canal and kept her tone neutral while asking the paramedic how far apart the sounds were. "Seconds," he said. Seconds meant sequencing, not accident. The charge nurse finally called a mass casualty alert, voice tight but still uncertain. The overhead announcement echoed through the halls, and movement accelerated toward chaos. Yet inside the intake corridor the lanes held, patients moved forward instead of sideways, and equipment appeared where it was needed because she had placed it there before anyone knew why. No one thanked her. No one asked who directed the pattern. They only noticed the emergency department had not collapsed under the sudden weight. She glanced once more at the silent dispatch panel and understood the threat had not finished arriving. The sirens outside stopped all at once. Not fading, not overlapping. Cut off. That silence pressed harder than the noise had. For a moment the emergency entrance held only the hum of fluorescent lights and the low alarms of monitored patients. Then the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened with a mechanical chime, too calm for the tension in the air. Boots stepped out first, polished leather carrying a trace of street dust. A uniform followed, pressed and precise, rank insignia catching the overhead light. The man walked with the pace of someone who already understood the scale of what he was entering. Staff assumed administration had finally called military support for crowd control. A resident began explaining the situation before the man reached the nurse's station, but he did not slow. His eyes moved across the hallway once, measuring spacing, noting the divided lanes, the repositioned equipment, the absence of clustering panic that usually marked uncontrolled intake. He stopped at the center of the corridor and asked in a level voice that carried without effort, "Who established your intake sectors?" The charge nurse started to answer defensively, citing protocol and improvisation, but he was already looking past her. He saw the whiteboard numbers written small enough to avoid attention, yet placed exactly at sightline height. He saw the oxygen tanks grouped near the structural column rather than the wall, ready for relocation if a perimeter shifted. He saw the families positioned just outside a camera blind spot without realizing they had been protected from it. His gaze settled on the new nurse as she adjusted a pressure bandage without looking up. "Are you the tactical lead here?" he asked. The room reacted with confused amusement, a few staff exchanging looks at the phrasing. She finished securing the dressing before answering. "No designated lead," she said quietly. Then after a brief pause added, "Flow is being maintained to preserve triage integrity." The wording altered the air around them. He stepped closer, voice lowering. "Your intake intervals dropped below 3 minutes. You split primary and secondary assessment without formal declaration. Why?" She kept her hands steady on the chart. "Sequential arrivals with patterned injuries indicate continuing hazard. Deep intake increases exposure risk. Lateral containment preserves throughput." Their exchange was brief, but carried a vocabulary unfamiliar to most in the room. The charge nurse frowned, sensing conversation happening outside her authority, but not yet understanding why. The officer nodded once, confirmation passing between them without explanation. "Communications upstream are restricted," he said. "We expect additional contaminated casualties and possible device remnants." She replied, "Then your perimeter is incomplete." Not accusation, not challenge. Assessment. He accepted it as such. Turning to the staff, he spoke only what was necessary. "Continue current lanes. No one moves patients past this corridor without clearance." The order held because it sounded less like command and more like alignment with what was already functioning. She moved to the supply cart and removed extra saline bags, placing them at measured intervals along the intake path. He observed without interfering. "You prepared for extended hold," he said quietly beside her. "Prepared for misreporting," she answered. A stretcher rushed in, carrying a patient whose clothing smelled faintly metallic, not blood, something sharper. She directed decontamination wipes before full entry, preventing contamination spread before anyone realized the risk. He noted the action and keyed his radio, issuing a brief update using phrasing that mirrored hers rather than standard incident language. Staff began to notice that the officer did not correct her positioning, did not override her quiet adjustments, and when a surgeon demanded patient transfers deeper into the ward, the officer deferred a response until she shook her head once. He then denied the transfer. Confusion turned gradually into uneasy respect. Authority had shifted without announcement. She continued charting vitals, never raising her voice, never claiming command, yet the corridor now moved according to a structure neither hospital policy nor military protocol had formally declared, but both were following. The colonel watched a moment longer before speaking low enough that only she heard, "You recognized the pattern before dispatch did." She did not look at him. "Patterns repeat," she said. "People do not want them to." Another siren approached in the distance, slower this time, heavier. Neither of them reacted outwardly, but both adjusted position by half a step, already accounting for what the next arrival might carry. The next ambulance did not rush the entrance. It rolled to a measured stop, and the paramedics stepped out without calling ahead. One of them held the rear door a fraction longer than necessary before opening it fully. The hesitation was small but wrong. The colonel noticed it. So did she. The patient on the stretcher was conscious, breathing evenly, injuries minor compared to the others, superficial cuts, controlled bleeding, stable pulse. Too stable. The paramedic avoided eye contact while giving the report, words correct yet empty of detail. She guided the stretcher into the intake lane, but did not allow it past the midpoint. "Hold here," she said quietly, as if checking paperwork. The staff nearby assumed routine verification. She adjusted the blanket and felt the rigid geometry beneath the fabric along the patient's abdomen. Not anatomy, not medical equipment. The patient's breathing changed when her hand paused over it. Not fear of pain, fear of discovery. She met the colonel's eyes once, and then looked toward the far trauma rooms filled with ventilated patients who could not be moved without risking death. Evacuation would require disconnecting life support for at least 6 critical cases. Time they did not have if the device was live. The colonel spoke softly into his radio, requesting an ordnance team, but the reply carried distance and delay. Too far. She understood the calculation instantly: clear the corridor and risk moving unstable patients, or contain the threat where it stood and accept responsibility if wrong. The charge nurse approached, irritated at the pause in flow. "We need the bay open," she said. The new nurse answered calmly, "Temporary hold for assessment." The tone carried enough certainty to delay argument, but not long. The patient whispered that he could not feel his hands, not neurological loss, circulation restricted by bindings beneath the clothing. She kept her voice level. "You're safe." Stay still. She did not say why. Panic spreads faster than shrapnel. She turned to the colonel. If we evacuate, we lose the intubated, she said quietly. If we stay, we control blast direction. He looked down the corridor, measuring walls, distance, structural columns. You're asking to contain inside a hospital, he replied. I'm stating the consequence either way, she said. A resident overheard enough to pale, asking what was happening. She handed him a chart and instructed him to prepare additional saline for hypotension, redirecting him away from the stretcher without explaining. The colonel waited half a breath, then nodded once. We contain, he said. No announcement followed. No alarms. She repositioned the stretcher exactly between two reinforced support columns she had noted earlier when moving oxygen tanks. She stacked supply carts along one side, not as barricade, but as directional shielding. Staff believed she was clearing space for procedure. She instructed a technician to shut the double doors at the end of the corridor to reduce noise for patients, sealing distance without revealing purpose. The patient's breathing quickened as he realized movement had stopped. Please, he said, voice shaking. I didn't. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. Do not move, she repeated, steady enough to quiet him. The colonel cleared the immediate area under the pretense of sterile procedure, moving families and excess staff out without triggering alarm. Inside the narrowed corridor remained only essential personnel who did not yet understand they had been chosen because they would remain calm. She cut carefully along the clothing seam, revealing the device, compact, shaped for fragmentation control, timer obscured, but active by faint vibration felt through the casing. Improvised, yet deliberate. She did not flinch. Pressure trigger possible? She said softly. The colonel positioned himself opposite her, shielding the wider ward with his body, as if distance alone could matter. She adjusted the patient's arm to prevent involuntary movement and continued speaking to him in the same calm tone she had used all night, explaining breathing, counting seconds so his panic would not translate into motion. Every instruction was medical on the surface, tactical underneath. Minutes stretched heavy and slow. Outside the corridor, the hospital continued operating, unaware of the quiet center holding its breath. She accepted the choice fully then. If the device detonated, she was closest, and the blame would follow her decisions rather than the institution's hesitation. She leaned closer, steady hands locating the tension point along the binding strap where release would not jolt the mechanism. The colonel watched without interruption, trusting competence he had not yet explained to anyone else. Her fingers eased the pressure incrementally, controlling force through the patient's breathing rhythm. The faint vibrations stopped. Silence returned, deeper than before. She kept her hand in place for several seconds longer, confirming stability, then looked up once. Trigger neutralized, she said quietly. No one cheered. The corridor simply exhaled, and she remained beside the stretcher as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, already absorbing the weight of the decision she would later allow others to question. Morning light reached the emergency entrance in a thin gray line across the tile. The hallway looked smaller without the pressure of sirens behind it. Equipment stood where it had been left in the night, supply carts angled slightly, tape marks on the floor showing where gurneys had paused and turned. Environmental services moved quietly, wiping surfaces that had already been cleaned once. The patient with the device had been transferred under military escort before dawn, paperwork minimal and explanations fewer. The hospital administration spoke in low voices about incident reports and liability language. They referred to the night as a complex intake surge rather than what it had nearly become. She finished chart corrections at the station, removing duplicate entries created during the alert and restoring normal bed designations to the board. No one asked her to do it. Order returns fastest when someone restores the small details first. A resident paused near her desk, wanting to ask something but settling for a simple nod before walking away. The charge nurse reviewed staffing assignments and hesitated before placing her back into a standard patient rotation instead of observation duty. The choice was deliberate, neither punishment nor promotion, just a quiet acceptance that routine would continue. Near the ambulance doors, the colonel waited alone, uniform now carrying the faint creases of a long night. He did not interrupt her work. When she finished, she approached without hurry. "Casualties?" she asked. "Contained," he replied. "Your corridor prevented secondary injuries." He handed her a folded form acknowledging external coordination assistance, unsigned by any hospital authority. She looked at it briefly and then set it on the counter without comment. Recognition written on paper would create questions the hospital did not want answered. He understood and did not insist. For a moment they stood in the same silence that had filled the hallway hours earlier. "You left command service," he said quietly. Not a question. She adjusted the strap of her identification badge. "I changed uniforms," she answered. Footsteps approached, and he stepped back, the conversation dissolving before others could hear it. Administration entered discussing policy review and stopped when they noticed him. They thanked him formally for federal cooperation, never connecting his presence to the nurse beside them. He accepted with a brief nod and turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused once, glancing back only long enough to confirm she had already returned to checking a patient's blood pressure. Posture unchanged, movements precise and unremarkable. The hospital resumed its normal noise gradually. Phones ringing, carts rolling, voices layering into familiar disorder. Staff moved through the corridor she had held overnight, now just another passage between rooms. No announcement marked the shift change. She disposed of her gloves, washed her hands, and took report on the next patient waiting in triage, asking routine questions in the same even tone. A new technician joked nervously about the previous night's confusion, and others smiled with the relief of distance. No one corrected him. The board filled with ordinary complaints, fractures, fevers, minor injuries. Outside, traffic passed without sirens. The colonel's vehicle was gone. She documented vitals, signed her name at the bottom of the chart, and moved to the next bed as if the night had been another shift among many. The hallway remained standing, intact, not because anyone had declared leadership, but because someone had quietly carried it until it no longer needed carrying.